When a special horse at Pinewood Farm goes into labor, the farm workers expect a normal birth. But as the hours pass with no sign of the baby, panic spreads through the barn. The horse is in trouble, and what should have been an ordinary night turns into a desperate fight to save her. But when something finally comes out, the farm workers start screaming. It's nothing like they expected. The old Pinewood Farm had been around for decades, known for producing some of the strongest and most beautiful horses in the region. It was a vast ranch, home to over 200 horses, majestic stallions bred for competition, sturdy workhorses, and prized broodmares that ensured the farm's future. Running a farm of this size was no easy task, and keeping track of everything was a constant challenge. Foals were born almost every day, each one bringing new hope for the farm's success. Among the many horses at Pinewood, one mare stood out, Grace. She was young, strong, and intelligent, with a deep brown coat that shone in the sunlight. Though she had only birthed one foal before, she had already earned a reputation for being a remarkable broodmare. Her first pregnancy had been effortless, and when the farm hands went to sleep one evening, they awoke the next morning to find a healthy colt standing beside her in the stable. It had been the perfect birth, the kind that every breeder hopes for. Because of this, when Grace became pregnant for the second time, no one had any reason to worry. Jacob, the stable manager, had worked at Pinewood Farm for over 20 years. He had seen countless foals take their first steps, had raised horses from birth to championship, and had developed an unbreakable bond with the animals in his care. But of all the horses on the farm, Grace held a special place in his heart. Before she arrived at Pinewood, Grace had belonged to a reckless and irresponsible farm owner. She had been neglected, underfed, overworked, and treated like nothing more than a source of income. By the time she was rescued and brought to Pinewood, she was exhausted and frightened, hesitant to trust anyone. Jacob had been the one to help her recover. He had spent months gaining her trust, ensuring she was well fed and cared for. Under his watchful eye, Grace had transformed into the healthy and powerful mare she was now. It was because of this past that Jacob felt an even deeper responsibility toward her. He had seen what she had been through. He would never let her suffer again. When Grace was confirmed pregnant for the second time, Jacob and the farm's owners were thrilled. Given her first successful birth, they expected another smooth pregnancy and delivery. The resident veterinarian monitored her closely, performing routine checkups and ensuring she received the best nutrition. For months, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Grace remained strong and active, her appetite was healthy, and the vet confirmed that both she and the foal were progressing normally. But no one could have predicted what would happen when the time came for her to give birth. It was late one evening when the farmhands noticed Grace behaving strangely. She paced around her stall, restless and agitated. She refused to eat, her breathing was heavier than usual, and she kept shifting her weight as if she couldn't get comfortable. Jacob knew immediately Grace was going into labor. He gathered the team, preparing for another seamless birth like her last one. The vet was called, and the farmhands stayed close, watching for the moment when her foal would arrive. Hours passed. Grace was still in labor, but something wasn't right. The contractions had started, but there was no sign of the foal. The minutes dragged into hours, and still nothing happened. Grace was in visible pain, her body straining, her breaths coming out in short, desperate bursts. Jacob's concern deepened. This wasn't normal. After 4 long hours, the situation became critical. Grace should have already given birth by now, yet she was still struggling. Jacob could see the panic in her eyes, the way her muscles trembled as she fought against whatever was happening inside her. That's when the vet uttered the words that made Jacob's stomach drop. She's in distress. Something is blocking the birth. A wave of fear washed over the stable. The room, once filled with anticipation, was now thick with tension. Grace was in trouble, and if they didn't act fast, both she and the foal could die. Jacob clenched his fists. He had promised himself that he would never let Grace suffer again. And now he was about to face the hardest challenge of his career, saving her life. Jacob's hands were clenched into tight fists as he watched Grace struggle. Sweat glistened on the horse's coat. Her breathing was heavy, and her legs trembled with the effort. Something was wrong. He had seen countless births in his years at Pinewood Farm, but this wasn't normal. The baby should have arrived by now. Instead, Grace was caught in a battle her body wasn't winning. The vet knelt beside her, feeling along her belly, his face grim. "She's in distress," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to act now." Jacob felt his stomach twist. He had known Grace for years, had watched her recover from the neglect of her past, had seen her become one of the strongest horses on the farm, and now she was suffering again. The farm workers gathered around, waiting for instructions, but no one dared to speak. The usual excitement of a new birth had been replaced with dread. Grace let out a sharp cry, her body tensing as she pushed again, but nothing happened. The vet grabbed his tools, his expression hard. "We need to help her. If we don't get the baby out now, we could lose them both." Jacob didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do." The next few minutes were a blur of movement. The vet reached inside, his hands steady but fast, his focus sharp. Grace's breathing quickened, and Jacob could feel her panic. He stroked her head, whispering softly, trying to keep her calm. "She's stuck," the vet muttered. "I can feel the baby, but it's not coming out on its own." Jacob's heart pounded. If the baby was stuck, that meant Grace's body couldn't push it out. She was too exhausted, her body too strained. They had to pull it out by hand. The vet gave Jacob a look. "We need to move quickly!" Jacob nodded. He positioned himself as the vet instructed, ready to help. The vet gripped the baby inside, carefully but firmly, and began to guide it out. Grace let out a painful sound, her body tensing as she fought against the pain. "Easy, girl," Jacob murmured. "You can do this." The vet pulled again, his muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, there was movement. Jacob's breath caught as he saw something appear. A leg, then another. Almost there. With one final careful pull, the baby slid free. For a moment, everything was still. Then the farm workers gasped. One of them let out a sharp cry. Jacob's eyes widened as he looked down at what they had just pulled out. It wasn't moving. It was too small. And it wasn't alone. Lying on the straw-covered floor were two tiny babies, their bodies frail and weak, their breaths barely there. The barn erupted into shouts as the workers rushed forward, unsure of what they were seeing. "Twins?" someone whispered. "That's impossible," another said. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. He had been around horses his entire life, and he had only heard of something like this once before. Horses almost never had twins, and when they did, the babies rarely survived. The vet moved fast, checking both of them, his face unreadable. Jacob could hardly breathe as he watched. Were they alive? Were they strong enough to make it? The vet exhaled. "They're alive," he said, "but barely." Relief flooded Jacob, but it was short-lived. The hard part wasn't over. These babies were weak, much smaller than they should have been. They wouldn't survive on their own. Grace lifted her head, her eyes tired but alert. She nudged one of the babies gently, as if checking if it was real. Jacob knelt beside them, his heart heavy. "We need to help them," he said. The vet nodded. "They need warmth, food, round-the-clock care. If we don't act fast, we could lose them." The workers sprang into action. Blankets were brought, bottles were prepared. The twins were moved carefully, wrapped in warmth, held close as they were fed drop by drop. Jacob sat beside Grace, rubbing her head as she lay still, exhausted. She had given everything she had to bring these babies into the world. Now, it was up to them to keep them alive. As the night went on, the tension in the barn slowly eased. The twins were weak, but they were fighters, and so was Grace. Jacob watched them, his chest tight. He had seen miracles before. Maybe, just maybe, he was witnessing another one. The sun had barely risen over Pinewood Farm when Jacob stepped into the barn. The air was still thick with the tension from the night before. Grace lay on her side, her body exhausted, her breathing steady but slow. She had given everything to bring these twins into the world. Now, the real challenge had begun. The two tiny babies lay wrapped in soft blankets, barely moving. Their legs were thin, their bodies too small for newborn horses. Jacob knelt beside them, his heart heavy. They had made it through the birth, but that didn't mean they would survive. "Any change?" he asked, his voice low. The vet, who had stayed the night, shook his head. "They're still weak. We need to keep feeding them every hour, and keep them warm. If they get cold, they won't make it." Jacob exhaled. He had seen many births on this farm, but never one like this. Horses weren't meant to have twins. It was too dangerous, too unlikely. And yet, here they were. One of the farm workers, a young man named Ted, walked in carrying bottles of warm milk. "They didn't take much last time," he said. "Maybe they'll drink more now." Jacob nodded and reached for one of the bottles. He gently lifted the smaller of the two, cradling it in his arms. Its tiny body barely weighed anything. He pressed the bottle to its mouth, waiting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the baby started to drink. A small wave of relief passed through him. It wasn't much, but it was something. Grace lifted her head, watching them. Despite her exhaustion, her eyes were alert. She let out a soft sound, stretching her neck toward her babies. Jacob moved closer, letting her nuzzle them gently. "She knows they're hers," Ted said. Jacob nodded. "And she's not giving up on them." Neither were they. The next few days were a battle. The twins had to be fed every hour. They had to be kept warm, wrapped in blankets, their tiny bodies pressed close together for warmth. The vet checked them constantly, monitoring their breathing, their heart rates, their strength. At first, progress was slow. Some hours, they barely drank. Some hours, they seemed too weak to move. But Jacob refused to let doubt creep in. He had seen how strong Grace was. Maybe her babies had that same strength. By the end of the week, there was a shift. The smaller twin, the one Jacob had feared the most for, started drinking more. It lifted its head, its legs twitching as if trying to stand. The other followed soon after, moving a little more, eating a little better. Then, one morning, as Jacob checked on them, he saw something he never thought he would. The stronger twin wobbled onto its legs. It was shaky, barely able to stand, but it was standing. Jacob froze, his breath caught in his chest. "Look at this," he murmured. Ted and the vet rushed over. "He's trying," the vet said, his voice filled with cautious hope. The twin took a small, clumsy step, then collapsed back onto the blankets. But it had stood, and that meant something. Day by day, the twins grew stronger. They stood for longer. They walked a few steps, their bodies filled out, their movements less fragile. Jacob didn't want to say it out loud, but he was starting to believe something impossible. They might actually make it. Word spread around the farm. Workers who had whispered doubts now came to see the miracle babies. Even the farm's owner, a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, stopped by the barn to watch. "I never thought I'd see this," he admitted to Jacob one evening. "Twins, and they're surviving." Jacob looked over at Grace, who was now standing, watching over her babies protectively. "She's the reason they're still here," Jacob said. The farm owner nodded. "She's special!" Jacob already knew that. By the end of the second week, the twins were strong enough to walk without falling. They followed Grace around the barn, their movements still a little clumsy, but improving every day. It was a miracle. And yet, as Jacob watched them, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. This had been impossible. And somehow, against all odds, it had happened. What if there was still more to come? The morning air was crisp as Jacob stepped into the barn, the scent of fresh hay mixed with the warmth of the horses. He had barely slept, his thoughts still caught on the two little miracles now standing beside Grace. The twins, once weak and barely able to lift their heads, were now walking, eating, and growing stronger with each passing day. It was something no one on the farm had expected. Yet, the danger wasn't over. Twins and horses were rare for a reason. Even if they had made it past birth, there was still the risk of long-term health problems. Their legs were thinner than normal, their energy lower than it should have been. The farm's vet, while amazed, kept his concerns quiet but present. "They've made it this far," the vet told Jacob that morning, "but we need to keep watching them. They're still at risk for weakness, infections. We don't know if their bodies will hold up as they grow." Jacob understood, but he wasn't ready to give up on them. He had seen what determination could do. Grace had survived against all odds before, and now her babies were proving just as strong. The farmhands had started calling them Shadow and Ash, names that matched their thin but growing bodies, one darker, one lighter. Despite their small size, they had fiery spirits. Every morning, Jacob watched them nudge each other playfully, trying to run, trying to be like the bigger horses around them. Grace stayed close to them, always watching, always alert. She nudged them gently when they lost balance, stood protectively between them and anything she saw as a threat. She had nearly died bringing them into the world. Now she would fight just as hard to keep them here. It wasn't long before word spread beyond the farm. Pinewood was already known for breeding strong, beautiful horses, but now it had become home to something almost unheard of. Breeders, trainers, and horse enthusiasts started showing up, eager to see the miracle twins for themselves. "They shouldn't be alive," one visitor murmured as he leaned against the fence, watching Shadow and Ash stumble across the field. "And yet they are," Jacob said simply. The attention made Jacob uneasy. He knew that people weren't just here to admire the twins. They wanted to know if they were worth something. A horse with an unusual birth story could be profitable, but Jacob wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about keeping them safe. Then, one afternoon, the worst happened. Jacob was finishing his usual rounds when he heard a sharp cry from the field. His heart stopped. He ran toward the sound, his boots pounding against the dirt. As he reached the fence, he saw Ash lying on the ground, his small body trembling. Grace was beside him, nudging him, her eyes filled with worry. Jacob's stomach dropped. Not now, not after everything. He knelt beside the small horse, running a hand down his side. He was warm, too warm. His breathing was quick, uneven. The vet rushed over, already pulling out his supplies. "He's got a fever." Jacob swallowed hard. "Can you help him?" The vet didn't answer right away. He worked quickly, checking Ash's breathing, his pulse, his temperature. The other workers stood back, holding their breath. Grace let out a soft, low sound. She was watching Jacob, as if waiting for him to fix this, to save her baby. Jacob clenched his jaw. "Tell me what to do!" The next few hours were a blur. They moved Ash back to the barn, wrapped him in blankets, fed him carefully, kept him cool. Grace never left his side, pressing close, standing over him protectively. Shadow, too, stayed nearby, nudging his brother as if willing him to get up. The night passed slowly. Ash's fever stayed high. Jacob barely moved from his side. Every few minutes he checked his breathing, his heartbeat, his temperature. The whole farm felt like it was holding on to a single moment, waiting to see what would happen. Then, just before dawn, Ash stirred. Jacob sat up straight, hardly daring to believe it. The little horse's eyes fluttered open. He let out a weak but steady breath. He was still here. Jacob exhaled, finally allowing himself to feel relief. He reached out, stroking Grace's head. "He's a fighter, just like you!" The fever broke later that day. Ash was weak, but he was alive. The danger hadn't passed completely, but they had made it through one more impossible night. Jacob didn't know what the future held for the twins, but one thing was clear: they weren't going anywhere without a fight. The summer heat had settled over Pinewood Farm, casting long shadows across the open fields. The twins, Shadow and Ash, were no longer the fragile newborns they had once been. They were still smaller than the other young horses, but they had survived against all odds. Ash's fever had been a terrifying reminder of how delicate they were, but he had recovered, proving once again that he and his brother were fighters. Jacob still watched them closely, never letting his guard down. He had spent decades working with horses, but these two had changed him. He had seen them struggle, seen them fight to stand, fight to live. He had never believed in miracles before, but maybe he did now. And yet, something still gnawed at him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Twins were rare. Surviving twins were even rarer. And for both of them to grow stronger, to keep beating the odds, it felt like something was still waiting to happen. One evening, the farm owner approached Jacob as he stood by the fence, watching the twins. "They're growing," the older man said. "Stronger than anyone thought." Jacob nodded. "They've got Grace's spirit." The owner was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking. She's recovered now. Maybe it's time to breed her again." Jacob's jaw tightened. He had been dreading this conversation. "We got lucky this time," Jacob said, keeping his voice steady. "Too lucky." The owner sighed. "I know the risks, but we're careful. And after those twins, you can't tell me people won't pay for another foal from her." Jacob turned, his eyes dark. "You're not thinking about another foal. You're thinking about another set of twins." The owner didn't deny it. Jacob exhaled sharply. He knew the farm was a business. That profit mattered. But this wasn't just any horse. This was Grace. And if something went wrong this time, she wouldn't survive it. Still, the decision wasn't his alone. After long discussions with the vet, they decided to give Grace one final pregnancy, with extreme caution. No risks, no chances. Everything would be monitored. The months that followed were filled with careful planning. Grace's diet was carefully adjusted, her health monitored daily. The farm took every precaution to make sure she stayed strong. At 5 months pregnant, an ultrasound confirmed she was carrying only one baby. Jacob felt a small relief. No twins this time, no impossible outcomes, just a normal pregnancy. But Grace's body told a different story. At 7 months, she was larger than expected. The vet wasn't concerned at first, but Jacob felt uneasy. Something didn't feel right. At 9 months, Grace showed signs of discomfort. It wasn't uncommon, pregnancy was always hard on horses, but Jacob could tell something was different. She was restless, uneasy, more agitated than normal. Then, one night, she went into labor early. Jacob was in the barn when it started. He saw it in the way Grace shifted, the way her breathing changed. She knew something was happening. He didn't waste time. "Get the vet," he called to one of the workers. Within minutes, the barn was alive with movement. The vet arrived, farm hands gathered, everyone prepared for the birth. But something was wrong. Grace was in labor, but she wasn't progressing. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. Jacob's fear returned, just like before. Then, just as before, the vet's face darkened. "Something's blocking the birth." Jacob's breath caught. No, not again. The vet moved quickly. He checked, felt inside, then froze. He turned to Jacob, his expression pale. "Jacob, there's more than one." Jacob's heart stopped. No, that wasn't possible. The ultrasound had shown only one. The vet had checked. How could there be more? But there was no time to question it. Grace cried out, her body straining. The birth had begun. And this time, what came out would leave everyone in shock. The barn was silent except for Grace's strained breathing. Every farmhand stood frozen, their eyes locked on what was unfolding before them. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. The vet's words echoed in his head. "There's more than one." But that wasn't possible. The ultrasound had shown only one baby. They had taken every precaution to make sure Grace had a safe pregnancy. And yet, as she pushed again, another small body slipped into the straw, landing beside the first. Then, before anyone could even react, a third appeared. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. Then, the barn erupted. "Triplets?" someone gasped. This can't be right," another whispered. Jacob's vision blurred as he stared at them. 3 small bodies lay in the straw, barely moving, their coats damp, their legs tucked beneath them. Triplets. Impossible. 1 in 300,000 births. That's how rare it was. Most didn't survive. Some weren't even fully formed. But these 3 tiny horses were alive. Grace let out a tired, weak sound, her head falling back against the ground. Jacob snapped back into action. "She's exhausted," the vet said, already kneeling beside her. "We need to check them, now!" The farmhands rushed forward, gathering blankets, warm towels, and anything they could find. Jacob moved fast, his hands shaking, as he touched the first baby, a filly with a brown coat, just like Grace's. Her tiny chest rose and fell, her breath faint but steady. He turned to the next, a colt, completely white, his thin legs curled under him. Then the third, another colt, smaller than the rest, his coat a mixture of brown and white, barely moving. Jacob swallowed hard. "Are they okay?" The vet checked each one carefully, his face tense. "They're alive," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "But we need to act fast if we want to keep them that way." Jacob didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the smallest colt, wrapping him in a warm blanket. The farmhands did the same with the others, moving quickly to bring them closer to Grace, keeping them warm against her body. Grace, still too weak to stand, turned her head and nudged them gently. Her exhaustion was clear, but so was her instinct. She knew they were hers. The night became a race against time. The first few hours were critical. The triplets were too small, too weak to stand. They needed constant warmth, feeding, and care. The farmhands worked in shifts, watching them closely, feeding them drop by drop, making sure their tiny bodies didn't get too cold. Jacob barely left the barn. He had spent years working on this farm. He had seen difficult births, had lost horses before, had witnessed both heartbreak and miracles. But nothing like this. By morning, the triplets were still alive. The news spread through the farm like wildfire. Workers who had doubted Grace's second pregnancy now stood outside the barn, whispering in awe. Some shook their heads, calling it a fluke, a mystery, a miracle. Jacob didn't care what they called it. He just wanted them to survive. Days passed, and the triplets grew stronger. Slowly, carefully, they began trying to stand. Their legs wobbled, their tiny hooves barely able to hold their weight, but they didn't give up. Then, one evening, as Jacob watched over them, it happened. The filly, the strongest of the 3, stood up for the first time. She wobbled, swayed, nearly collapsed, but then she steadied herself. Jacob's chest tightened. He had never believed in luck or fate. He had always believed in hard work, patience, and care. But looking at the little horse standing before him, he started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Grace was meant to defy the odds. And she had done it one final time. The sun was setting over Pinewood Farm, casting a golden glow over the pastures. The triplets, the impossible three, were still here. Against all odds, against every expectation, they had survived. Jacob stood by the fence, watching as the filly, now named Luna, trotted beside her brothers. She had been the first to stand, the first to walk, the strongest from the start. Her coat had deepened into a rich brown, the perfect mirror of Grace. The white colt, named Bruce, was the fastest. Once his legs had grown strong enough, he had taken to running across the fields as if he had always belonged there. His thin, frail frame had filled out, turning him into a sleek, athletic horse. The third, the smallest, was named Theo. He had struggled the most, barely making it through those first nights. But now he was standing, walking, and playing alongside his siblings. He was still smaller than the others, but he was sharp, quick to learn, always watching. It was a miracle. Jacob had spent his entire career working with horses, but nothing like this had ever happened. And it never would again. Grace had recovered well, but the farm made its decision. This would be her last pregnancy. No more risks, no more chances. She had done enough. She had given everything. From now on, she would live as a riding horse, free from the demands of breeding. She had earned it. Jacob often took her out on slow, peaceful rides. She was strong again, her body no longer weak from pregnancy. She carried herself with pride, as if she knew what she had done, what she had survived. And she wasn't the only one who carried her legacy. Bruce, the white colt, grew into a powerful racehorse, breaking records on the track. He had speed in his blood, and with the right training, he became a champion. Luna, the filly, became a broodmare, carrying forward the strength of her mother. Over the years, she had many healthy babies, but never twins, never triplets. What had happened with her birth had been one of a kind. Theo, the smallest, was never meant for racing, but he had something the others didn't, an instinct for people. He became a therapy horse, working with children, his gentle nature making him a favorite among riders. Years passed. Jacob aged along with them, but Grace remained the heart of Pinewood Farm. Her story whispered among new farm hands, her triplets a legend that would never fade. One afternoon, as Jacob walked to the pasture, he saw her standing there, watching over her full-grown babies. She was older now, her coat speckled with hints of gray, but she was still Grace, still the survivor. Jacob smiled, reaching out to run a hand along her neck. "You never did things the easy way, did you?" he murmured. Grace let out a soft sound, pressing her nose against his hand. Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "That's why you'll never be forgotten." And she never was. Her story, the impossible twin birth, the triplets that should have never survived, became more than just a tale told at Pinewood Farm. It spread beyond the ranch, becoming one of the most incredible horse stories in history. Because some horses are special, some horses defy the odds, and Grace, the mare who had survived the impossible, was one of them.